Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Google Ads API webinar. My name is Adam Oren. I'm a developer advocate for the Google Ads API. I'm broadcasting to you live from this live stream from our Singapore office. Good morning to everybody in Singapore. Good afternoon, evening to everybody listening on the West Coast of the United States and to anywhere in between. This is our first webinar live stream of the day. We're going to do this now, 9 a.m. Singapore time, and this live stream will happen again at 9 p.m. Singapore time. So if you're planning to attend both, please don't. It's going to be the exact same thing. We're just covering more time zones and having a wider opportunity for everybody to answer questions during the live stream. So the webinar later today is going to be the exact replica of what we're doing right now. Okay, we're going to get started. Just a couple of housekeeping things. This is actually our third webinar in a series of Google Ads API webinars. We did a first webinar when the Google Ads API beta was first introduced and released back in May. In the meantime, we did a hotel ads API webinar, which was geared specifically towards hotel partners and the changes that they can expect with the Google Ads API. And today is our third webinar in this series. We're going to be focusing in this talk on the roadmap, the upcoming API roadmap and migration. So that's the main topic of this talk. We are going to talk about a few other things, mention some features and things like that, but for the most part, that's the main takeaway and the main focus of this live stream today. So before we get started, just some housekeeping on the Q&A for this live stream. You'll notice at the top of the screen and also in the chat for the live stream about 15, 20 minutes ago, I pasted a link. If you open that up right now, it'll bring you to a form where you can ask questions at any time. You can type some questions in there. You can also see that there are questions that I already pre-populated into the form with the prefix pre right there. When we announced the webinars in our blog post, we sent a form out to everyone where they can submit questions ahead of time. So we've gone ahead and we've copied all the questions that were submitted into there. So if you see a question that resonates or that you wanted to ask, please don't ask it again, just upvote it. Click the little thumbs up sign there. And then when we get to the Q&A, we'll make sure we answer the questions in the order of the upvotes to make sure that we get to the most pressing questions first. But we will get through all the questions, so it'll just be a matter of getting through them. Okay, so let's get started. What's going to happen in the next 45 minutes or so? I'm going to give you a quick overview, recap of the Google Ads API beta, what it is and why it's important. Don't want to get too far into the weeds on recapping what we covered already in the first webinar if you were there and watched it a few months ago. But we are going to give a quick recap of that. And then we're going to get into updates that have happened since then. So what's occurred in the beta program since we last spoke on a webinar series like this. And we're also going to show an API roadmap. So this is a little bit new. And this is, I think, what a lot of people have been asking for. One of the key questions that came up in the last webinar Q&A was what's going on, what's the roadmap, what's happening with the AdWords API, the Google Ads API beta, when can we expect a production release, what can we expect from the AdWords API. So we have some information that we're going to release to you today. Then we're going to get into some of the new features, touch on some of the main highlights of the Google Ads API beta, and sort of get the juices flowing, hopefully get you a little bit excited about some of the new features that you can expect in the API that are not necessarily there in the AdWords API and why they may be interesting to get familiar with and use in any new upcoming development that you may be planning. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about migration strategy. We're just going to cover some high-level points, the more important things to consider when migrating from the AdWords API over to the Google Ads API, and talk a little bit about some sample migration plans. So what would a migration plan look like? What would the timing be? We'll give you some guidance. Not going to get too far into the details of what code changes you need to make, but we want to give you a little bit of a framework on how to start thinking about this, because depending on how big your current API use is, this could be a fairly significant task. So we want to at least set the stage, give you some ideas of how we expect people to approach the migration task. And then we'll get into the Q&A and answer the questions that came up along the way. Okay, first of all, an overview. This is basically, if you watch the first webinar, you'll notice this is sort of a variation on a theme. The next generation of the AdWords API is here. 6 months ago, we mentioned the next generation of the AdWords API was on its way. So while we're still in the beta program, we're not going into production just yet. One of the main takeaways of this, if you want to get the 30,000-foot overview of the information we're trying to get to you today, is the core of the API is here. Now is the time to start planning and start looking at the API, because the core functionality for the new Google Ads API beta has been released as of our V06 release last week. We'll get into a little bit into what was exactly released and what features you can expect. But the key is the next generation, the AdWords API, is here and now in beta. Okay, so a little bit of the sort of the top level key selling points. What can you expect? Why is it important? Why are we releasing a new Google Ads API to replace the AdWords API? So first of all, the first major pillar is we're innovating the ads platform. The new Google Ads API will allow us to more quickly roll out new features, update our client libraries on a much more frequent and much more convenient basis, and provide better upward compatibility with further releases of the API, and also allow us to integrate more seamlessly with other APIs out there, because as you'll see in the next few slides, it's a more modern API. SOAP is on its way out. The AdWords API, I think, is a bit long in the tooth in the XML and SOAP department. I think a lot of people who've been working with the AdWords API for a long time have been a little bit frustrated by the fact that they have to deal with XML and SOAP when they get into software development. We're modernizing the API and bringing it sort of front and center with a lot of our modern cloud infrastructure, and placing it as a first-class citizen with a lot of our other Google APIs. And the other major tenet that the Google Ads API bring everyone is increased developer productivity. One of the key things that I think we harped on a little bit in the last webinar, and we're still going to pound on here because it's so important, and one of the key features of the new API is we're unifying the object model for both entities like campaigns, ad groups, keywords, and statistics and metrics like impressions, clicks, costs. We now have a unified way of pulling objects and retrieving data from the API, and a unified query language for doing so, which we think will make it a lot easier and a lot more unified working with this API. Gone are the days where we sort of have two separate APIs, the SOAP mutate API and the AdWords API, and the separate reporting endpoints. They're unified now. You don't have two separate endpoints, two ways of doing things. So we think that's going to make things a lot easier for our developers. And with that comes an easy and powerful query language, the Google Ads query language. So it's a SQL-like language that you can use to issue statements to the API, select campaign name, ID, clicks, costs, stats, and you'll get data back from the API, the campaign objects, and the stats that you asked for at the same time. And the API stack, the client libraries are consistent with Google's latest standards. Again, we're moving away from SOAP. We're moving to a RESTful interface and protocol buffers and gRPC, both of those at the same time. I'll show you a little bit how that's going to work. So this is going to make it a lot easy to interact with other APIs that are out there in, for instance, the cloud ecosystem. If you want to use some of our latest machine learning APIs, some of the BigQuery APIs, any of our cloud APIs, we're on the same modern stack as the rest of our core Google Cloud infrastructure. So it's going to make it very easy for developers to interact with other APIs. Okay, so the Google Ads API itself, that's a high-level selling points. What are the technologies behind this? Modern API architecture. So we're switching from SOAP to gRPC and JSON REST. This is going to be an API with actually two separate interfaces. If you use our client libraries, you can interact with protocol buffers and gRPC over high-performance HTTP2. Otherwise, you can also use JSON REST, for instance, from the command line, or roll your own requests. You can submit regular JSON requests with, for example, curl over the command line using normal HTTP and JSON. A unified API data model. Again, we have the Google Ads query language that has unified both reporting endpoints and our retrieval of campaigns, ad groups, keywords, and objects like that. And we've also enabled scalable data download. So we've modernized the infrastructure. One of the key pain points of the AdWords API, of the legacy AdWords API, is that downloading large amounts of data can be troublesome. You can run into timeouts, some sort of deadline exceeded errors on our side. So we've gone a long way into making sure it's reliable to download large amounts of data. So we have a page data model where when you request data from us, the data comes back to you in bite-sized pages. You define the page size, how much data you want back, and we stream it to you as you request it. For very large data stuff like that, we cache it server-side until you request the amount of pages that you need. So we spool it and then feed it back to you in a scalable way, so you don't necessarily have to worry about timeouts and deadline exceeded errors and things like that. So we think it's going to make a big difference for really scalable use cases of the Google Ads API. Okay, a single API with two protocols. What does that mean? Well, that means exactly what it says. We have a backend for the Google Ads API, and we expose it to you in two different ways. So we have our gRPC, which is Google's open source standard for using protocol buffers over HTTP2. This is a high performance library and sort of the lingua franca of the API. Behind the scenes, this is the closest to what is actually being done in the backend. However, if you're not using our client libraries or otherwise want to roll your own, we do expose a RESTful interface that you can use. So you're not limited to just using gRPC. Again, you'll get the gRPC sort of for free if you use our client libraries. That's what they use, and that's what they're built on. Currently, we support Java, .NET, PHP, Python, and Ruby client libraries. You can go to the Google Ads API developer documentation site and go to our GitHub links and download these client libraries now. And if you use them out of the box, you're automatically using gRPC behind the scenes. You don't have to do anything else. But if you want to, or if you're trying to use a language that we don't have a client library for yet, that is definitely possible. And it's as simple as what's on the right side of the screen here. You can use curl from a command line. And this is an actual query, change some of the IDs and stuff like that to make it generic. But this is an actual query from the command line using JSON. So you can see from what's on the screen here, we posted a query that's in that Google Ads query language. It looks like SQL in the post form of this curl statement. And the results are JSON that comes back. You get campaign objects. You get an embedded metrics object. So you can use this in any client language that you like for things that we don't have client library support for. But if we do have client library support, we strongly recommend that you use it because these are built with a lot of helpers and use high performance gRPC behind the scenes. So this gives you a much more flexible model for working with the API. You have sort of your choice of client libraries and environments to work with. Okay, updates and roadmap. So let's get into, I think, what everybody is yearning to know and why a lot of people are here and tuned in today. So let's talk a little bit about, first of all, just to get an idea of what's coming, I want to give you an idea of where we've been. So here's the current status. We're on this red mark here. So just a quick recap. On April 23rd, we released the V0, sort of the first version of the Google Ads API beta. The AdWords API, since then, has had two releases on our regular release schedule. Our version 2018-06 and our version 2018-09 of the AdWords API have been released. And in that same time, we've also iterated the beta program and had V04, V05, and just last week we released V06, the latest pretty significant release of the Google Ads API beta. And that latest release of the Google Ads API beta is pretty important. First of all, since version V04, I can say that we've removed the whitelist from the Google Ads API beta program. So that's one important thing that's happened since then. Before we get into why V06 is important. So that's one of the major changes that has happened since we last spoke and had a webinar on this topic. So you don't necessarily need to be whitelisted to use the Google Ads API beta anymore. Anybody can sign up and use it. There's no whitelist and there's no form you have to submit. But more importantly, just last week, with V06 of the Google Ads API, we implemented the core set of RMF features. So if you're not familiar, this RMF is required minimum functionality. And it's sort of an MVP feature list if you were implementing a full service ads platform. If you were trying to replicate what we have in the Google Ads user interface and build your own third-party ads management platform, we have a policy that lists a set of sort of minimum viable product features. This is what we expect you to implement in a product in order to make sure that our Google Ads customers have the same experience and can access all the features that can make them have the best experience in Google Ads. So it's pretty important that we were able to get most of those features into the beta. So a lot of them are there now. Most of them are there now. see what the API is going to look like. There may not be 100% coverage yet, and all the features may not be fully implemented, but the skeleton is there. So we now are confident enough to say that what the Google Ads API looks like and what you're going to get when we're in production is currently there in the beta. So now's the time to start planning because the skeleton is there. So just to reiterate where we're at and how we got here, in V0 of the beta, we implemented some core features, not quite enough to fill out a full feature set and get an idea of how to implement. A lot of things were still missing, but we had some core campaign creation, ad group creation, keyword creation features implemented. Since then, we implemented some incremental updates. We released the whitelist, and where we are now is we've added the RMF feature set with V06 that we released last week. And that's sort of setting the stage and the marker in the sand for where we are as far as what features are available. And as we progress and get towards V1 and the production release, we're aiming to get to full parity with both the RMF feature set and what's also in the AdWords API, so there's no gap. We'll release some new features along the way, some of which we've already released. We're going to talk about a little bit later. And when we hit V1.0, it will be production ready. But to talk about where we are today, the RMF feature set contains a lot of important features. Again, this is sort of the skeleton of what any ads management platform would need to do its job. So we're pretty confident that most people who are trying to implement something in the Google Ads API can take a look at V06 since we've implemented the core RMF feature set and understand what the API looks like and what tasks they're going to need to plan for ahead. That includes things like account management, many ads formats, manipulating audiences, conversions, feeds, keyword planning, shopping, a whole bunch of things. Again, if you're not familiar with what the RMF is, here's a link to the RMF. I know that a video is not the most conducive environment for clicking on links. We're going to share this this slide deck after the fact, so don't worry, you'll be able to click on this later. But almost everything that's listed in the RMF in some form or another should be in V06. Again, this might not be 100% coverage, and the features may not be 100 set feature complete yet, so there may not be exactly 100% coverage, but most of it is there now. So that's the important thing. So that's what we have, and that's what we released last week. So that's why we're pretty confident that this is an important milestone. We wanted to get this information to you. Okay, so what does the future look like? Here's where we are, and now we can look ahead a little bit. And I think here's where things get interesting, and I think this will answer some of the questions that were answered or asked, for example, in the last webinar. Today, we're pretty confident in announcing that we will have V1 of the Google Ads API released in Q1 of 2019. We're targeting the end of January, beginning of February, so it will probably be in the earlier half of Q1, but we're going to say Q1 just to give everyone some wiggle room and not have to narrow it down to a specific date and time. But expect the first half of Q1 2019 to have the production version 1.0 of the Google Ads API. That's when you can expect to see it. And an important side effect of that, once we release version 1.0 in January, there are not going to be any more releases of the AdWords API. So that's sort of the second major thing that we want to announce today and make clear to everyone who's working with the AdWords API. Version 2018-09 that was released at the end of September of the AdWords API is the last version of the AdWords API. No new features and no new incremental updates to the AdWords API are coming. We will keep it on for a while. 2018-09 will not sunset imminently like the other versions of the API will, but 2018-02, 2018-06 will sunset on the normal version schedule that we have been following for version releases of the AdWords API. However, 2018-09 will stay working until 1 year after the version 1.0 release of the Google Ads API. And at that time, 1 year after our version 1 release in Q1 of this year, we are planning to sunset the AdWords API. So that's sort of the third component of the announcements that we want to get out to you today, that there is a sunset coming for the AdWords API. It will be plus 1 year from now, specifically plus 1 year from when the Google Ads API goes into production mode in Q1 of 2019. So that will give you most of 2019 to have both APIs online side by side in a production environment to effect a migration. And we will get into exactly what that entails a little bit later on in the webinar. But the key takeaways here, and I think the important things to take away from this roadmap, are one, that 2018-09 was the final release of the AdWords API. No new feature development is planned. So you can expect our efforts now are going to be shifting to the Google Ads API. New features will be released there. We are not going to necessarily backport any features and release them into the AdWords API. We will still be submitting bug fixes and making sure the AdWords API version 2018-09 still works and is production ready, and there are no problems with it. But new features, all of our efforts are going to now be pointed to the Google Ads API going forward. Another important side effect is the AdWords API and the Google Ads API will coexist in 2019. They will both be production APIs that you can use side by side, and that side by side notion goes more than just both of them being in production at the same time. You actually can use both APIs simultaneously in the same client code, in the same process. Both SDKs, both client libraries, can be in the same project, and you can use these two APIs side by side. So that gives you a lot of freedom to how you can migrate. And again, we're going to have a little bit more later on in this presentation about migration, but both of these APIs can work together. So we don't necessarily expect people to be going whole hog and migrating their entire code base all at once in one go. Take it in pieces. You can use both APIs side by side. If there's a new feature, for example, that you like in the Google Ads API, you can start using it right away. Keep your old code base intact. Things will work as you expect. Okay, and finally, or third, I've got one more after this. The AdWords API will sunset approximately 1 year after the Google Ads API version 1.0 is released. So both, again, will coexist through 2019. An exact sunset date will be announced when we get closer to that time. We're not necessarily ready to announce the exact date when the Google Ads or the AdWords API will be sunset. That's a bit predicated on exactly when the Google Ads API version 1.0 goes into production, but you can expect the AdWords API sunset date will be 1 year from that. And finally, just some guidance going forward. Existing and new development should plan to use the Google Ads API. So now is the time to start planning. If you have new development plans, for example, if you haven't started using the AdWords API yet, if you're at this webinar just to get a flavor of what's going on before you've actually started your development, please, please, please take a strong look and strongly consider using the Google Ads API natively if you can. I know it's a beta API right now, so if you have some constraints on when you need to go into production, if it needs to be before Q1 and before the version 1.0 of the Google Ads API is released, then by all means, please continue to use the AdWords API. But the Google Ads API will be in production imminently. So the end of January is about a month away. So after the holidays, we're actually looking about a handful of weeks, work weeks before the Google Ads API. We expect to have it in production. So Q1 2019. I know it's an abstract date, but considering where we are right now, that's not actually that far away. So please, please, please be aware that this is coming, and if you can, find ways to start planning to use the Google Ads API, because the AdWords API days will be numbered once the Google Ads API is in production. Okay, so that's the announcement of where we are, what we've done, and what's coming ahead. Before we get into some migration planning, I want to talk a little bit about some of the new features because they are pretty interesting. I want to make sure that there's some good information here and give you a tour of some of the cool new things that are coming in the Google Ads API as well. So the first thing, again, you've heard us, we keep pounding on this, the unified data model and the Google Ads query language, but we want to emphasize it again because it really cannot be emphasized too much that this is the key sort of keystone of the API and one of the things that sets it apart in the biggest way from the AdWords API. So fetching data with the Google Ads query language. We now have a unified query language similar to SQL. It's called Google Ads query language for fetching both objects and reports. So if you're downloading data from this API, no matter how you do it, you're going to be using this Google Ads query language. First-class Google Ads objects like campaigns, ad groups, keywords, and metrics like impressions, clicks, and costs are fetched together from the same from the same service and using the same request. So if you look on the right side of the slide, this is sort of an example result of what you get back in JSON format from a sample request from the API. One of the interesting things here is you get what we're calling seamless data joins between related entities. So what this is at its core is keyword request, getting impressions, clicks, costs for keywords. But you'll notice that you also get, and those are represented, as ad group criteria in this request on the right side. But you'll notice that you can also get ad group and campaign objects in the same request. So when you request related entities together, if there's a hierarchical nature to them, it's sort of like a seamless database join. You get all the related metrics related objects coming back together without having to do too much. Let me show you what that looks like and what we mean by that. So this is showing a Python snippet. A couple other slides are going to show a couple different languages, just so you get an idea that you can use this from very different languages, but what you're doing looks the same. But here's what it looks like to send that query in Python using the Google Ads query language. So it looks a lot like SQL, right? You select keyword text, ad group name, campaign name, and it's the metrics that you're interested in here: impressions, clicks, CTR, average CPC, and you get back the metrics that you're interested in for the keywords that you want, but you also get back the ad group and campaign that that correspond to those keywords. And all you had to do was just list them in the select statement. What we do is we know there's a keyword can only be in one ad group, and an ad group can only be in one campaign. So you get a seamless data join and a fusion of all the objects involved in the hierarchy for this request, and you can get them all coming back together. And when you get them back, the campaign, ad group, and ad group criterion object that you get here, these are the exact same objects that you can send back to the API in a mutate request. For example, if you downloaded these objects and you were looking at the clicks, and say there were a couple rows of these, right? One had clicks 7, like it's on the screen here. One had clicks 3, and you wanted to pause the campaign that had clicks 3. You can actually take the campaign object associated with that row and send it right back to the API by just changing its status field from enabled to pause. You don't necessarily, for example, in the old AdWords API, have to construct a SOAP object, copy the IDs from the report that you just downloaded, and fiddle with the objects and send it back. So these are first-class objects in the SDK that come back that you can manipulate directly. So the Google Ads query language is pretty powerful, and you'll also see in a couple of the other slides, it's also used in other ways as well, not just reporting. Like we said, this is a unified object retrieval method. So any time you're getting data from the API, you're going to use this same method. So once you understand it and learn how it works, it's applicable to pretty much everything you do with the API, and unlocks how some of the other features work as well. Okay. Another major thing that we're bringing to the Google Ads API is explicit manager account authentication. So this is something that became a little bit more prevalent more recently, because we recently, or fairly recently, in the past year or so, I'm not sure exactly when, but in Google Ads in general, we made a change that allowed multiple Google accounts, or one Google account to be associated with multiple Google Ads accounts. And that had some interesting side effects for how you work with the API. So what we're trying to do in the API is make it explicit when you have a situation where you're dealing with a Google Ads account that can theoretically be an admin on more than one manager account. We want to give you a way to explicitly tell us on the API side which account you meant to log in as, because using the old AdWords API, this is not explicit. If you had a situation where, like that's positioned here on the right, where an API user had access to 2 manager accounts, there was no real way to specify which one you meant to log in as. And this is analogous to sort of the Google Ads UI. When you log into the manager interface, you're always logged in as a certain user. Even if you have access to multiple managers in the MCC hierarchy, you're always logged in as one or the other, and it's explicit who you're logged in as. So it makes it very explicit what you can do and what you can't do as that account you're logged in as. So this avoids ambiguous access semantics for sensitive operations like billing and manager account link mutation. For example, if you had a situation like this and you were logged in with an account that had multiple access and you couldn't specify which one you meant, you could theoretically be acting as an account that you didn't mean to. So we have a new header that allows you to explicitly specify which which manager account you're logged in as, and it's going to be required for any API call that gets authenticated as a manager account. Now, I'm going to make this a little bit more explicit. I know there's a lot of words, but I think it's one of those things where a picture and a diagram speaks 1,000 words, right? So you have, let's say you have a situation like this, right, where you have a global manager account at the top and you have, say, 2 regional manager accounts, sub-MCCs, sub-manager accounts underneath it for, say, the Western region and the Eastern region. And they allow you to access a pool of client accounts. Now, if your API user is attached to the global manager account and that's the only one that API user has admin access on, then it's very clear what you have access to, right? From the root global manager account, you have access to everything in the manager account hierarchy. You can access the sub-manager accounts, you can access the client accounts. That's very clear. Alternatively, if the API user was just granted access to one of the regional accounts, then when you did API operations, set up billing, tried to mutate links from client accounts to manager accounts, then you can only act on this portion of the MCC hierarchy. If you tried to access the global, anything in the global manager account or anything in the Western regional account, you would be explicitly denied because you don't have access to those accounts. But what we're talking about here is the case where the API user has access to multiple Google Ads accounts. So the API user at gmail.com, that Google account, was invited as an admin user to 2 different manager accounts that happen to be in the same MCC tree. So if you tried to do something, what does your access permission look like? So in this case, it's not clear, and there's no way to explicitly define how to, who you meant to be acting as, who you meant to be logged in as in a case like this. So that's why we introduced this new header called login customer ID, and it acts very similarly to the regular customer ID header that you set on every other API operation. And it can be set in very much the same way. So this example is in Java, in our Java client library. You can set this header in 2 ways, either in the ads.properties file, and again, there's analogous methods to do this in the other client libraries. So you can set this once in the ads.properties file, so set it and forget it, and it'll just be there for all your API operations. Or if you're going to be switching this up and plan to dynamically manipulate this at runtime, you can also set this in code. So when you construct a client object in code, just like you can set the developer token, the customer ID on the request, you can also set the login customer ID. And what that does is that makes it explicit which manager account you meant to log in as. So going back to the diagram here, when you make a request like this, you set login customer ID to that of the Eastern regional account, then the API knows, okay, that's who you meant to be logged in as, so we're not going to give you access permission to things in the global manager account or the Western regional account, even though that account does, that the corresponding AdWords Google account does have access to those accounts. This makes it explicit what you meant to do and prevents you from sort of that unexpected privilege escalation that could occur when a situation like this creeps up. So I want to make you aware that that's a new thing in the Google Ads API that you're going to need to set when you're logging as a manager, a Google account that's attached to a manager account. Okay, another major feature of the Google Ads API. So this is less sort of infrastructure and more sort of like a bona fide feature. We are exposing what we call the recommendation service. This is analogous to the Google Ads UI recommendation screen that you see on the right here. So this is a screen in Google Ads that gives you performance optimizations and recommendations for it. Maybe you should add some keywords to your account. Maybe you should change some targeting settings, things like that. We're exposing this programmatically to allow developers to implement and leverage the same optimizations that we expose in the Google Ads UI programmatically. And we're also allow you to filter these recommendations by whatever type you're interested in and apply or dismiss these recommendations as well. So you can actually, instead of having to just read these recommendations and figure out how to construct the corresponding operations that they represent, just like you can click apply in the user interface in Google Ads, you can actually in the API, when you find a recommendation you like, literally just say apply and it will get applied. So going back here, now we're using a Ruby code example. Again, hitting home the fact that we're using the Google Ads query language to, now this isn't for reporting, this is actually to pull down recommendation objects. So again, the same query language, the same Google Ads query language here is being used in the context of fetching recommendations as well. So you'll notice that you can filter on a recommendation type. So we have a whole bunch of recommendation types that are exposed now. One of them is text ads. So if we have any ad recommendations, like new ad creatives that the system decided to come up with themselves, you can fetch that using this example here. But we also expose some others, like changing your ad rotation and optimizing that better, adding new keywords, changing your bidding strategy, things like that. So you can use the where clause in this Google Ads query language to filter to what you're interested on and fetch the corresponding fields for the recommendations. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like, here's a sample JSON response of getting keyword recommendations using a request similar to what we had on the previous slide. You'll notice when you get the recommendations back, you actually get what the keyword is that was recommended. So this is actually for a sample campaign that advertises our Google Ads developer blog. And so I ran the recommendations on it to get a sample response, and it recommended some keywords. The first one here, Google campaign, a broad match Google campaign, and the second one, Google Ad Search of broad match. And it also gives you the recommended CPC bid micros that it suggests to go along with that. So not only do you get the keyword, but you get a corresponding CPC setting. And the most important part here is that all you have to do to accept one of these recommendations is on the recommendation service, there are two actions: apply recommendation, dismiss recommendation. And you just apply in the resource name here, you see you get this token, this recommendation key that you can, it's unique to this particular instance of a recommendation. You just apply the recommendation, give it the key, and it applies it. Or correspondingly, if you didn't want to take it, dismiss it. So I can apply the first one, it gets added to the campaign in question. Dismiss the second one, it doesn't get added, and you can also filter it out since it's been dismissed. The next time you make an API call, you can say, give me all the new recommendations that I haven't dismissed yet, or that haven't been dismissed yet in the Google Ads UI. So it's sort of exposing the full feature set of the recommendations UI to you programmatically in the development environment. Okay, another one here, this change status service. This is a new one, and I think has been sort of an open feature request and a lot of demand for this one for a while. The change status service is analogous to the change history in the Google Ads UI. It gives you programmatic access to the entities in a Google Ads account that have changed during a certain period of time. So you can say during the last 7 days, last 30 days, last 2 months, what changed in this Google Ads account, so that you can, for instance, audit what's happened in the account, or if you're trying to synchronize what your client sees, what your client code sees, versus what changes maybe a user made in the Google Ads UI, or maybe that were made by another tool that they're using. You can fetch what's happened in the Google Ads account over time and do things based on those changes. At the current time, you can identify which objects were added, changed, or removed. But we do plan on exposing a little bit more granular information as we implement more of this particular feature. So do look in the future for updates to this service, especially when we get closer to releasing the production version of this 1.0. We are looking at ways to expand what we expose to you, for instance, giving you the values that have changed and things like that. So what's there now is a taste of what's to come. We do plan on expanding the service more. So here's, again, Google Ads query language, front and center. This isn't a particular language. This is just the request that you would send in any language, whether it's Python, Ruby, Java. Here's a select statement that you would send to the Google Ads API. So you could select a whole bunch of fields related to the change from change status, where change date was in the last 7 days. So this is getting all changes that have occurred in the last 7 days. And the response, here's an example response. You get a whole bunch if there are a whole bunch. This is just one in a list of many, but just to give you an idea of what this looks like currently, is you get the change, its timestamp, what it was that changed. So in this case, you see the resource type says ad group. You get the resource ID, so you get the idea of exactly which ad group changed, and its status. So change indicates it wasn't added, it wasn't removed. This is a pre-existing ad group, and something about it changed. So this is what you can expect to get back from response today. But again, please look in the future for more updates to this. We're planning to expand what you can get back from the service to include more granular information. So hopefully we'll be able to get you data about the actual values that change, so you can do a little bit of diff to see what's changed and plan accordingly. So this is the change status interface. Yeah, so pay attention to this because there are more features coming in this area as well. Okay, so now I want to switch gears a little bit, give you an idea of some of the new features and some of the interesting things in the API towards migration. A general strategy, what to expect, how we expect developers to approach this migration, because this can be fairly significant. Okay, so the guiding principles of a migration like this that we really want to emphasize: plan early, scope generously, divide and conquer. So planning early means planning now. One of the reasons we're giving this webinar is you have enough information, you have enough ammunition now to start putting together a plan. Even if you're not ready to start making changes or writing code, we know it's the holidays, we don't expect anybody's dev teams to start ramping up right now and doing things, but now is the time to start planning. Scoping generously. Scope a lot of time. This is plan on this being a little bit bigger than you thought it was going to be. Give yourself some wiggle room. Don't try to minimize the effort involved. Divide and conquer. We want you to go and implement this migration in pieces. Going back to what I said a little bit earlier, we don't want people to try to do this all in one go, migrate the whole code base in sort of one big effort. You can use these APIs side by side, the AdWords API and the Google Ads API, and we expect people to do so. So in the planning stages, getting from the AdWords API to the Google Ads API. So what we mean by planning and what you can do now, what we expect people to be starting to do right now up until we go to version 1. While we're still in the beta, you can plan. So that means getting familiar with the documentation, understanding the features that are available, getting an idea of how things work. Understanding the technology and the key differences. So understanding if you're using one of the client libraries, understand how it works, understand the intricacies involved in using the client library in, for example, that uses protocol buffers now versus the SOAP client library, and what you may have to change and the things, hopefully, that get easier. That's one of the key things here is hopefully, since things are a lot more modern, the client libraries are more streamlined, things will actually get easier. You may have to change things, but these are going to be optimizations. Things will get better. And you can also prototype with some example code. We have a lot of example code released, and we expect people to start prototyping. Okay, scoping. The scoping step, start assigning resources, planning what the effort is going to look like, estimate the time and effort it's going to take to do things. Again, these don't have to be too granular, and err on the side of caution. So once you have some estimates and you've planned out how long it's going to take in certain areas, our recommendation, go back, add extra time, add extra 20% to the time or something like that. You don't want to be up against a time crunch for a migration like this, especially if your integration, your code base is very big. And finally, once you start coding, define bite-sized units of work. Don't try to migrate everything at once. Go service by service, group things together, maybe the part of your code that creates campaigns, does reporting, group it together, migrate that, leave other things untouched for the time being. Migrate the logical groups of services together. And the most important thing to do during this, and what makes this possible, is you can use both APIs together during the transition. So you can, for instance, have your reporting all switched over to the Google Ads API using the new Google Ads query language, while creating campaigns and things like that still relies on the AdWords API. That's totally fine, and that's the right way to do it. So the divide and conquer step, again, just to put this into pictures, say you had an integration that had 4 main components, right? You're doing account creation, campaign management, bid optimization, and reporting. Okay, and everything is starting on the AdWords API. The idea is to take the logical groups of services involved in, say, campaign management or reporting. So for campaign management, that's the campaign service, that's the budget service, because every campaign also needs a budget. Group the campaign service and the budget service in the context of campaign management and migrate that piece of your code and piece of your software stack over. For reporting, take the reporting endpoints that you're using, translate the current reporting definitions. If you're using AdWords query language, translate that over to Google Ads query language, and migrate your reporting over. While you're doing that, you can still keep bid optimization, account creation, for example, on the old AdWords API, and this can be sort of your stack, and running side by side, some pieces on the AdWords API, some components on the Google Ads API while you're migrating. A key thing to notice is optimize along the way. Okay, we expect, again, we expect code to be smaller. We expect things to be a little bit more convenient. So your overall code footprint and what your code looks like should change a little bit, but in a good way. We expect things to be a little bit easier and code to be a little bit smaller. The unified Object model and retrieval will allow you to eliminate redundant round-trip API calls using that method of retrieving objects together with their metrics. So we expect some API calls to be eliminated by using the unified data model. And by adopting our new client libraries, you can substantially, in certain cases, reduce code footprint. This is very dependent on the client library and the programming language in question. But for example, our Java programming environment, our client libraries for Java are up to 25% smaller in code by adopting the new client libraries because they're generated from the protocol buffer sources in an idiomatic way. For example, in Java, they rely very heavily on builder classes and things like that. So there's a lot less boilerplate code that you need to write, and things are a lot more streamlined. So that we did an analysis, and our preliminary results tell us there's about literally 25% smaller code footprint by just adopting our client library. So that's going to make a huge difference. And once you're finally done, you end up in a state where everything's on the Google Ads API and hopefully a little bit smaller and a little bit leaner. Okay, so putting this into context on like what a plan would look like, the different phases of doing this. Okay, we talked about what you could do, what you should be doing, but when, how to set these things up, what order to do things in. So there are three main phases. Well, actually four. Phases 1, 2, and 3, plus a phase 0, which is sort of a preparation phase that you can be doing now, right? Phase 0 is setup. Getting familiar with the API, making your first API call. These are things that you can be doing already. You could have been doing for a while since we released it. There's nothing blocking this. So this is something that's sort of a phase 0, pre-setup phase that you should be able to start doing right away. After that is sort of the first phase, the first real phase of a migration plan. Scoping and feedback, and then finishing your planning. Right now, while the beta program is still going on, along with evaluating the scope of the project, we want to hear your feedback. I have a feedback form that we'll share a link to everybody in just a minute here. But we do have a mechanism for collecting feedback, and we do expect people to use that. So please send us feedback. We're at a good time to be able to action that feedback. And also complete your planning. Verify the feature completeness of the API. Everything that you need is there. If not, obviously tell us. Complete a risk assessment for yourself. What could go wrong? What do you need to take account for? That feeds back into your scoping and planning. And finalize your migration plan. That will lead to the second phase, implementation. And this is where you actually do the coding, right? So the phase after that, again, migrate logical groups of services to the Google Ads API. Find bite-sized pieces of work. Group the services that comprise that bite-sized pieces of work, that component of your software, migrate it over. And being cognizant that you can run both AdWords API and Google Ads API side by side. And then finally, final phase, we do recommend it as a final phase, is sunsetting your AdWords API usage. So once you've done the migration, migrated everything over, make sure you're completely off the AdWords API. We've noticed this before, for example, when using just the AdWords API, when we do our version upgrades, sometimes you may have an old server somewhere, an old piece of code you forgot to migrate, still using the AdWords API, old version that was being shut off. So developers have run into that just using our version upgrades. So we are recommending that people make sure there's like sort of a full phase where they sort of clean up at the end and make sure you're fully migrated off the AdWords API, so there aren't any surprises when we shut that API off and you find out a piece of your software was still using it somewhere, and now you're in a bit of trouble because that got shut off unexpectedly underneath you. So just to make this a little bit more concrete, I want to overlay sort of those different phases on the timeline here for where we are. Phase 0, that's something that you could be doing right away. That's prototyping, look at the API, getting an idea how it works. Since version 0.4, when we released the whitelist, there was enough of it there where that's something that you could have been doing since the final release of 2018-09, and you can be doing right now. So there's something that you can be doing now, be familiar with, and theoretically could have already gotten done before last week, before V06 is released. Now that V06 is released, now we're at the point, again, because we have sort of that RMF skeleton, that core feature set, now's the time where we recommend you start scoping and planning migration. Even though things may not be feature complete, things may still be beta, there's enough of it there to understand what's involved in these tasks. So you can start planning a migration, scoping it, again, adding more time than you initially think. All that can be done between now and version 1. going into production in Q1 of 2019. And then if you sort of do that early, you'll have the first half of 2019, 4, 5, 6 months to effect the migration. This is where you actually do the code changes, migrate things over. And if you do that early, you'll be in a good spot where you can allocate sort of the rest of the remaining period of the sunset window, the rest of 2019 and possibly into 2020, depending on when that version 1.0 release gets put out, plus 1 year from that, to verify that you're completely off the AdWords API and your system is now fully on the Google Ads API. So just to outline that, put these sample migration plans onto the timeline and hit home the fact that we have, this is how we plan. This is how we hope people will approach this. It's not too early to get started. In fact, phase 0 and phase 1 are things that can be done, and you should start to at least look at now so that you can plan the sort of the latter half of your phase, writing the code in 2019, and not run up against any artificial deadlines that were sort of imposed by not getting started early enough. Okay. So that sort of covers it. I know we're sort of 50 minutes here. I want to keep the webinar to an hour, so I want to get into the Q&A as quickly as I can. The resources here, I'm not going to get too much into all these. The main thing to take away is the Google Ads developer site. All these things listed on the left are there on that developer site, including a migration guide, which I want to call your attention to. That does have a planning section that goes a little bit into what I covered today, and we'll continue to fill that out and make it more detailed as we get closer to the production release. API platform protocol buffers. This is sort of some conceptual architectural information, and if you want to get any information on the guts of how the Google Ads API works, those are some resources to get you started. And support, we have our developer blog. That's the main channel for announcements. Our forum, that's sort of our one-to-many support area where we give people support in a community environment. And dedicated support, I also want to call your attention there, AdWords API-support@google.com. If you have any questions that are very pressing, you need developer support directly from a support engineer, email us there. Within a day or two, one of our support engineers will get back to you one-on-one and help you resolve your problem, whether that's setting up one of our Google Ads API client libraries, whether that's trying to get something to work. If you have any questions about anything that can't be answered on the forum, please, please, please lean on that. And finally, feedback. I know we mentioned a few times during the presentation that we want feedback. So on the upper right of the Google Ads API beta site, there's a send feedback link. Click that, and it'll ask you if you're trying to give feedback about the actual page itself or the actual API beta. So the thing on the right, if you click on that, that'll bring you to a form where you can actually submit feedback to us about the beta program. Again, this isn't for technical support, but say you want a certain recommendation type, or you want a certain feature, you're not sure if it's going to be there, or you have a certain client library type in a certain programming language that's not exposed yet, but that's important to you. Send us feedback, fill out that form, send it to us. It'll get to us, and we'll be able to action that. So please, 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 this is the way to send us feedback, and it'll go directly to our product and developer teams who are working on the beta. Okay. Whew, so that's a lot of talking. I'm going to get to the Q&A. So I want to make sure we get some questions answered. So there's a lot of stuff in here that were answered ahead of time. So I'm going to sort these sort of by any questions that were upvoted during the presentation, and we will go through them in order. Okay. So the first one, what are your plans regarding product statuses? Will this field be available through the API? So product statuses, if I'm understanding this right, so product statuses, I'm assuming you're talking about product statuses for Merchant Center. So when you run a shopping integration, when you're running PLA, product listing ads for the Google Ads API or the AdWords API, a Google Ads account needs to be connected to Merchant Center. And the product statuses for Merchant Center are actually maintained and exposed by Merchant Center. Merchant Center has its own API. So the answer to this question is product statuses are already available via a different API. You can use the Content API for shopping to fetch product statuses for products and shopping campaigns. So this field won't be available in the Google Ads API, but it will still continue to be available where it is currently available now. So if you go on Google and search for a Content API for shopping, you'll get to the documentation for Merchant Center. And there's two endpoints in that Content API, product statuses endpoint and account statuses endpoint. Product statuses will give you exactly as it talks about individual product statuses, but if you want to get sort of aggregate account level product statuses for a Merchant Center account, see like how many products are disapproved, approved, things like that in the entire account. You can actually get aggregate metrics from the account statuses endpoint. So for this one, please take a look at the Merchant Center, the Content API for shopping, which is essentially the Merchant Center API, and those are available now. And that's not going to change with the Google Ads API. Second question, is an equivalent of the shopping performance report plan stats aggregated at the offer ID product level? So I believe so. We are looking at, we're still working on mapping all the old reports from the AdWords API and getting them into the Google Ads API. And I think shopping performance report and the information that you get out of that report is one of them. So I can't necessarily say what form that's going to take because we are still working on that. But we are aware that there's a shopping, that people rely on the shopping performance report and the offer ID metrics that are exposed now. So we're aiming to have, even if we don't necessarily have report per report parity, we're going to make sure that there's a way that you get that data. So for this one, please stay tuned, and we will have more information about that as we release the shopping performance data in the API. But what form that's going to take, I'm not entirely quite sure yet. Will there be a Pro client library for the Google Ads API? That is a great question. We don't necessarily have an announcement now about an ETA for Perl specifically, but we are looking into exposing other client libraries in the API and having other client libraries for other environments. So please, what I'd recommend you do is the feedback form I just mentioned. Please fill out that feedback form. Let us know that that's of interest to you. Tell us why, so we can prioritize that and make sure that we're prioritizing the programming languages and the client libraries that are in the most demand. So if this is important to you, this is a blocker, if you have an existing Perl implementation, please reach out to us on the feedback form and you want a client library for it, let us know, make sure we know about it, okay? Okay, any plans to make a campaign goal available through the API for both get and set? Okay, so campaign goals, if I'm understanding this right, when you log into the Google Ads UI, you're presented with, and creating campaign in the user interface, you're presented with some screens, for instance, on what the goal of the campaign is, whether to drive website traffic, leads, purchases, and those customize the campaign in the UI for what features are available and which features you should use. But it doesn't necessarily change anything about the underlying campaign. It's still a search campaign or a shopping campaign or a display campaign. So as such, we don't necessarily have plans to expose sort of those Google Ads UI settings in the backend, so in the Google Ads API. But that being said, we do know that there's a little bit of demand for it, and this is another one I'd recommend you fill out the feedback form, sort of let us know what, if you'd like to have this, what you would do it for, so we get a better idea of the request and why this is useful, and we can sort of prioritize and see if it's possible to expose either campaign goals or other similar UI settings like this through you in the API, through the API to you. Okay, so any plans to expose all possible recommendations? So yes, we do plan on significantly expanding the number of recommendations that are exposed in the API. The set that's there right now is definitely not all of them. So you can expect once we get to production and version 1.0 of the Google Ads API hits, there's going to be a much bigger list. I can't guarantee that every single one from the UI will be there, but we are planning to increase that significantly. So this is just a preliminary list. That list will get bigger over time. So yes, please look for more recommendations to be presented there. How can I get the API with Android Studio? Okay, so this one, I wasn't quite sure what this one meant, but you don't, the API and any of our SDKs are not necessarily tied to a specific SDK or IDE. So you're free to use any of our client libraries without Android Studio. Go to the Google Ads API developer site, and you could download from GitHub the client libraries and use them in any environment you need. So there is no inherent dependency on Android Studio. When will service accounts be available as an option? This is another good question. I don't have an exact ETA for. Service accounts, OAuth with service accounts is supported outside of our client library. So the limitation here is just our client library support. So I do know that we are looking into putting service account support in the client libraries, but one thing to keep in mind is that you can use client library, you can use service accounts for example, when you're using REST from the command line. If you roll your own and don't use a client library, service account authentication is supported. I don't think we'll be able to add it before version 1.0 is released, but look for service account functionality to be released right around version 1.0 or possibly a little bit after, if that's possible. We'll take this question as sort of an indication back to our client library team to see if we can get a better answer. And if we can, we'll announce it on their Google Ads developer blog. But probably not before Q1 of 2019, because that's when version 1.0 will be released. So at least Q1 2019 or after. But we are looking into putting service account support in the client libraries. So are there any performance differences between the two APIs? Okay, this is a great question. The most straightforward answer is yes, it probably is. But right now, a couple things to keep in mind. This is still beta, so we are still iterating and working on the performance. With that being said, if you do notice performance issues, please let us know. That's the feedback form is there. The support options are there. If you notice significant performance bottlenecks, we want to be aware of it. That's one of the reasons we have the API beta out, is to sort of kick the tires. But overall, we expect the performance, at least in a certain respect, to be a little bit better for the Google Ads API, in as much as we have support for the scalable data downloads now. We have the unified query language, so you can retrieve sort of more objects with sort of less round-trip API calls. So we do expect the Google Ads API in general to be a much more scalable solution than the AdWords API, but we're not quite ready to talk about specific benchmarks yet, especially when we're still sort of iterating on the specifics and performance during the beta process, the beta program. But please, if you do notice any specific performance issues and differences between the two, do let us know. How quickly do metrics refresh? Okay, this is also a good question. So when you're fetching impressions, clicks, costs, things like that, metrics are refreshed with the same schedule and have the same freshness as they have in the Google Ads user interface. There's no inherent difference between data freshness from the API and the Google Ads UI. So at the same time they show up in the Google Ads UI, you can expect that same freshness policy in the Google Ads API. What that means in practice is about 3 hours. So if you actually, if you Google Ads data freshness, the first link should be a Help Center article for Google Ads as a product that talks about our data freshness policy. It goes into some exceptions, but in general, everything is delayed about 3 hours in the time zone of the account in question. But certain things do have a little bit longer. So please check out our Help Center article on ads data freshness, and whatever you see in there applies to the API as well as Google Ads as a product. Okay, what is the future of conversion types? It seems like a high priority field that's still not available in the beta. So we do have, this is one thing that may have been released last week, V06 of the API. I'm not exactly sure when it was released, but I do know on our conversion action resource, we do expose both a conversion action type and a conversion action category. So it's possible that those are new since last week in version V06, but we do support conversion types in the API, for instance, whether it's a website click conversion, whether it's a shopping purchase, etc. These are exposed in, depending on the type you're interested in, whether it's a type or a category. Again, we have, look at the conversion action resource, look at the type field or the category field. That should get you what you want. So that should be there. Again, if there's other high priority fields that are still missing at this point, please let us know via the feedback form, and we can give you more clarity on where those are. Are there any plans to make change history feature in the API more robust to emulate what's available in the UI? So yeah, the answer in general is yes. Cover this in the change history section as well. We don't have any specifics on exactly what we're going to be able to get in time for version 1.0, but we do have plans to make it more robust in what's available insofar as exposing what data was changed and a little bit more granular information about the changes in general. Seeing an identified user that made the change, that's one that I don't know specifically. So again, this is another one I'd recommend using the feedback form. Let us know that you're interested in that, and the use case for that, and so we can prioritize getting that in there if it's possible. So I don't know specifically about identified user, but I do know that we are planning to make the change history feature a little bit more rich. Are there any plans to make billing issues available through the API? Even if it provided no billing information, it would be great to see whether ads weren't running due to a billing issue. So this is a feature request we've heard a few times from various sources, and yes, we are looking at it. I can't make a firm commitment on whether and when that will be in version 1.0 of the Google Ads API, but I can tell you that is on our radar to be able to expose some sort of information like the question is talking about here, just to at least be able to detect, is billing set up for a Google Ads account? So you can flag it to a user and say, hey, there's nothing I can do with this account, so you set up the billing properly. So that is something that we are looking at, and hopefully we'll be able to get in the new Google Ads API. As far as when, though, that's not something that we'll be able to commit to, but this is something I confirm that it's something that we are looking at. Are there any plans to make AdScript available in the broader Google Apps Script ecosystem? So Google Ads Scripts is a little bit beyond the scope of this webinar. This is mainly for the Google Ads API. So I don't really know. I can't really speak to the, future plans for AdScript. But I can say at least that this Google Ads API migration shouldn't affect much to do with Google Ads Scripts. There may be some changes to Google Ads Scripts coming that are related to some of the efforts that we're doing to modernize our infrastructure. But again, most of the things we're talking about in this webinar and the migration to Google Ads API from AdWords API shouldn't affect Google Ads Scripts too much. But again, this is a question I think better suited for an AdScript audience. So kind of sort of table this one for now. How do you get logs? Okay, this is a great question. Right now, we are working on implementing more robust feature completeness for getting logs in our client libraries. Right now, that's still an area where client libraries are not feature complete, but you can expect by the time we get to version 1.0 and release the Google Ads API in production, we will have a logging solution in all our client libraries similar to what we have in our AdWords API libraries, where you can, for example, enable logging and see the requests and responses that are being transmitted by the client library that you're using. So sit tight. How do you get logs is something that we're actively working on, and we'll make sure to impress the importance upon that with the team that's working on it. Okay, with the AdWords API, it was very easy to escalate bug investigation requests to the support team via human-readable SOAP logs. How should we escalate bug investigation to the support team for the Google Ads API if we're using non-readable gRPCs or data format? That's a really good question, and I think this goes back to sort of the the previous question: is where are the logs? I think right now one of the more important things you can do is you can send us code snippets. So if a certain API request is failing, send us a stack trace. You should at least get a stack trace or some sort of error surfaced in your developer environment, in the client library environment. So I think one of the best things you can do is send us a code snippet of the code that generated the error, and then send us a stack trace or whatever error that comes back from the API that gets surfaced into the environment you're working with. If you're using our the RESTful interface without the client libraries, then obviously you can send us the request and response. That's pretty easy to get. But for now, I think code snippets and whatever stack traces and error information you get back should be good enough to get our support team started, and they can follow up with you from there and help get whatever information they need to follow up. So that would be a good starting point that I'd recommend right now until we have logging solution in place. Resources you sent is more for intermediate or advanced level. I'm still beginner. Any resources to recommend in my stage? That's a great point. A lot of this is pretty advanced. So on the Google Ads developer site, we do have a we have a whole bunch of guides for getting started. So we have like the overview section, getting started guide. I recommend starting with some of the getting started and overview sections of the guide, and then from there, once you've read those, so you don't get too overwhelmed, I'd recommend going to our code examples in whatever client library and client environment that you're comfortable with, whatever programming language you know best. Go on GitHub, go to examples folder, go to the basic operations folder. So those will be the most basic operations we have. It has things like creating a campaign, creating an ad, setting a bid, bite-sized units of some of the most basic functionality that you can do with the Google Ads API. And look at those code examples, because I think a code example speaks like 1,000 words. We can put together all the guides we want, but programmers speak code. So I'd recommend going to our basic operations folder and any of the client libraries that we have examples for, whatever one you understand best as a programming language, and look at that. Go to, like, for instance, the ad campaigns example. It shows how to create ad campaigns. I think that's a great starting point for understanding how the API works. But we will take this as sort of feedback to have better resources for beginners in getting started. So start with that, and we will take this feedback back to our team to see if we can shore up our beginner resources to make sure there's a good on-ramp for people who are a little bit less experienced with the API and maybe still coming from it with fresh eyes or for the first time. So thank you for that. That's great feedback as well. Okay, I know we've gone a little bit over time. Thank you, everybody, for attending the API. I hope this was helpful to you, and we will likely talk soon on another webinar episode as we get closer or right around the Q1 release of the Google Ads API. Thank you very much.